If he does not have funds to pay off the judgment, then we will seek judgment enforcement mechanisms in court, and we will ask the judge to seize his assets.
Trump was held liable for exaggerating his wealth and inflating the value of his real estate so banks would give him low-interest loans. Trump insisted the banks liked doing business with him.
They said no victim, no one got harmed, the banks got paid back. So no harm, no foul. Why is that not the case in your view?
So financial frauds are not victimless crimes. He engaged in this massive amount of fraud, and it wasn't just a simple mistake, a slight oversight. The variations were wildly exaggerated, and the extent of the fraud was staggering.
Trump said the penalty against him would drive other businesses out of New York.
We'll appeal, we'll be successful, I think, because frankly, if we're not successful, New York State is.
So let's talk about something that's absolutely real and absolutely significant for understanding Trump's financial and legal situation right now. You might have seen videos with headlines like, "Trump screams as Marshals move to seize properties," and wondered whether U.S. Marshals have actually shown up at Trump Tower to padlock the doors and take possession of Trump's buildings. That specific scenario, Marshals literally seizing Trump properties right now, hasn't happened yet. But here's what you need to understand. The threat of that happening is completely real. The legal groundwork for that happening has already been laid, and the only thing standing between Trump and law enforcement officers taking control of his signature properties is a bond he posted and an appeal that could still fail. This isn't fictional speculation. This isn't dramatized what-if scenarios. This is a real enforcement mechanism that New York's Attorney General has explicitly said she's prepared to use if Trump can't pay the massive civil fraud judgment against him.
President Donald Trump and his co-defendants to pay more than $350 million. The ruling also bars Trump from running any company in New York for 3 years. Judge Arthur Engoron released a decision 4 months after finding Trump had committed fraud by inflating his assets and net worth, all to get better terms on loans and insurance.
Let me break down exactly what's happened and why the threat of Marshals moving on Trump's properties is so real and so significant. In February 2024, Judge Arthur Engoron issued a devastating ruling in the New York civil fraud case against Trump and the Trump Organization. The judge found that Trump and his co-defendants had lied for years about the value of their assets to secure better loans and better deals from banks and insurance companies. This wasn't just one or two exaggerations. This was a systematic pattern of fraud spanning years, where Trump claimed his properties were worth far more than they actually were to get financial benefits he didn't deserve. The judge ordered Trump and his co-defendants to pay roughly $355 million, and with interest acre-wing at 9%, that number climbed to about $454 million. Are you kidding me? Nearly $500 million in penalties for fraud. That's not a parking ticket. That's not a slap on the wrist. That's a financial penalty so massive it could actually threaten the Trump business empire. And here's where the property seizure threat becomes real and concrete. New York Attorney General Letitia James went on television and said explicitly what would happen if Trump couldn't pay. She said her office would seek judgment enforcement mechanisms in court. She said she would ask the judge to seize his assets. And then she said something that really drove the point home. She said she looks at 40 Wall Street each and every day, referring to one of Trump's signature Manhattan properties that sits right near her office. That wasn't just a passing comment. That was the Attorney General of New York telling Trump and the world that she's already identified specific properties she's prepared to go after if he doesn't pay what he owes. She's looking at his buildings. She's planning which ones to seize. She's ready to move. And James didn't just make threats on television. She took concrete legal steps to position herself for seizure. In March 2024, her office formally registered the civil fraud judgment in Westchester County. Now, you might be wondering what that means and why it matters. Registering a judgment in a county is a legal step that allows enforcement actions against property located in that county. Westchester County is where Trump owns the Seven Springs estate and a golf club. By registering the judgment there, James was laying the groundwork to go after those specific properties. Reuters described this as a possible precursor to asset seizures if Trump failed to post bond or pay the judgment. This wasn't just talk. This was the Attorney General taking the procedural steps necessary to actually seize Trump's property if it came to that. Trump managed to temporarily stave off collection by posting a bond. A New York appeals court agreed to pause collection of the judgment if Trump posted a $175 million bond within 10 days. Trump did post the bond. According to court filings, he managed to come up with the money and satisfy the court's requirement. That bond temporarily blocked the immediate levy and sale of his properties while his appeal goes forward. So, for now, James can't seize Trump's buildings because the bond is in place and the appeal is pending. But here's what you need to understand about that temporary reprieve. It's temporary. The bond doesn't make the judgment go away. The appeal might fail, and if Trump ultimately loses on appeal and can't pay the full judgment amount, the next steps really are lien filings, sheriffs or marshals executing writs, and Trump's prized buildings being taken to satisfy the debt. The property seizure threat isn't gone, it's just paused. What makes this situation so extraordinary is that we're talking about a sitting president fighting to keep state authorities from seizing his buildings. This is the image of American power, the President of the United States, and behind the rallies and the strongman talk and the projections of strength, there's a man scrambling to keep his business empire from being dismantled by court orders and enforcement officers. The contrast between Trump's public image of unlimited wealth and success and the private reality of scrambling to post bonds and avoid property seizure is stark and revealing. This is what the reckoning phase looks like. This is what happens when years of fraud finally catch up to you and the legal system actually imposes consequences. Let's get into the specific details of the civil fraud case and the property seizure threat, because understanding exactly what happened and how the enforcement mechanism works helps you understand both how serious this situation is and why the threat of marshals taking Trump's buildings is real, even though it hasn't happened yet. The civil fraud case against Trump was brought by New York Attorney General Letitia James after a lengthy investigation into the Trump Organization's business practices. The investigation found that Trump and his company had systematically inflated the value of their assets on financial statements that were provided to banks and insurance companies. This isn't a matter of opinion or subjective disagreement about what properties are worth. The evidence showed that Trump claimed his properties were worth far more than any reasonable valuation could support, and that he did this deliberately to get better loan terms, lower insurance premiums, and other financial benefits. When you lie to banks about how much your assets are worth to get better loan terms, that's fraud. When you do it systematically over many years across many different properties and financial statements, that's a pattern of fraud that causes significant harm to the financial institutions that relied on your false statements. Judge Arthur Angeran presided over the trial and issued a ruling that was absolutely devastating for Trump. The judge found that Trump and the Trump Organization had committed persistent fraud. The judge found that they had lied for years about asset values. The judge found that they had obtained ill-gotten gains through their fraud. And the judge imposed a penalty designed to disgorge those ill-gotten gains and punish the fraudulent conduct. The base penalty was roughly $355 million. But under New York law, interest accrue on civil judgments at 9% annually. By the time all the interest was calculated, Trump's liability climbed to approximately $454 million. That's nearly $500 million that Trump owes because a court found he committed fraud. The judgment also included restrictions on Trump's ability to do business in New York. The judge barred Trump from serving as an officer or director of any New York corporation for several years. The judge imposed similar restrictions on Trump's sons, who were also defendants in the case. The Trump Organization was restricted in its ability to obtain loans and do business in ways that affect its ongoing operations. So the judgment wasn't just about money. It was about restricting Trump's ability to continue operating his business in the ways he had been operating it. The combination of the massive financial penalty and the business restrictions represented a comprehensive legal defeat for Trump that threatened his entire business model. When the judgment was issued, the question immediately became whether Trump could pay. $500 million is an enormous sum, even for someone who claims to be a billionaire. And there were serious questions about whether Trump's claimed wealth was real, or whether it was inflated in the same way his financial statements had been inflated. Trump's lawyers claimed he didn't have the liquid assets to pay the judgment. They asked the court for relief from having to pay the full amount while his appeal proceeded. They argued that requiring immediate payment would cause irreparable harm because Trump might have to sell properties at distressed prices to raise the cash. Attorney General James responded by making absolutely clear what would happen if Trump didn't pay. She went on ABC News and said her office would seek judgment enforcement mechanisms in court if Trump couldn't pay. She said she would ask the judge to seize his assets, and she specifically identified properties she was looking at, including 40 Wall Street, a 72-story skyscraper in Lower Manhattan that Trump has owned since 1995. James said she looks at 40 Wall Street each and every day from her office. That comment was pointed and deliberate. She was telling Trump that she already had specific targets in mind for seizure, and that she was prepared to move on those targets if he didn't satisfy the judgment. The legal mechanism for seizing property to satisfy a civil judgment is well established. When someone owes money under a court judgment and doesn't pay, the person who's owed money can ask the court to enforce the judgment against the debtor's assets. The court can issue a writ of execution that authorizes law enforcement, sheriffs or marshals, to levy on and sell the debtor's property to satisfy the debt. The proceeds from the sale go to pay off the judgment. This happens all the time in civil cases, where defendants don't pay what they owe. What makes Trump's situation unusual isn't the legal mechanism, it's the scale and the identity of the debtor. We're talking about seizing properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars from a former president who's running for president again. But the legal mechanism is the same mechanism that's used to collect debts from anyone who doesn't pay their judgments. James took a concrete step toward enforcement by registering the judgment in Westchester County in March 2024. Registering a judgment in a county creates a lien against real property owned by the judgment debtor in that county. It also allows the judgment creditor to pursue enforcement actions against property in that county. Westchester County is where Trump owns the Seven Springs estate, a 213-acre property that Trump has valued at different times anywhere from $25 million to $291 million, depending on which financial statement you look at. Westchester is also where Trump owns a golf club. By registering the judgment in Westchester, James was positioning herself to go after these specific properties if enforcement became necessary. Reuters reported that this step was a possible precursor to asset seizures if Trump failed to post bond or pay the judgment. Trump's legal team asked the appeals court for relief. They argued that Trump shouldn't have to pay the full judgment while his appeal was pending. They argued that posting a bond for the full $454 million amount would be impossible or would require fire sales of properties that would cause irreparable harm. The appeals court agreed to reduce the bond requirement. Instead of requiring Trump to post a bond for the full judgment amount, the court said it would pause collection if Trump posted a $175 million bond within 10 days. That's still an enormous amount of money, but it's much less than $500 million. Trump managed to post the bond using a company called Knight Specialty Insurance to back it. With the bond in place, collection was paused, and the immediate threat of property seizure was averted while Trump's appeal proceeds. But here's what you need to understand about that temporary reprieve. The bond doesn't make the judgment go away. If Trump loses his appeal, he still owes the full judgment amount plus whatever additional interest has accrued. If he can't pay at that point, the seizure threat returns in full force. The bond is essentially a guarantee that Trump will satisfy the judgment if he loses the appeal. But it doesn't mean he has the money to actually satisfy it. The bond company took a risk by backing Trump's bond. If Trump loses and can't pay, there will be complicated questions about how the bond company's guarantee interacts with enforcement against Trump's actual assets. But one way or another, if Trump loses the appeal and doesn't have $500 million in cash, James has already laid out the enforcement path. Lien filings, writs of execution, sheriffs or marshals seizing properties, and forced sales to satisfy the judgment. The property seizure threat also has to be understood in the context of Trump's other massive liabilities. The civil fraud judgment isn't Trump's only huge financial problem. He owes money from the Jean Carroll defamation verdict. He has enormous ongoing legal fees from his multiple criminal and civil cases. His businesses face continuing challenges from the restrictions imposed by the fraud judgment. When you add up all of Trump's liabilities and compare them to his actual liquid assets, not his claimed net worth based on inflated property valuations, but his actual cash and easily convertible assets, serious questions arise about whether he can actually meet his obligations. The civil fraud judgment alone is enough to threaten his empire. Combined with everything else, the financial pressure on Trump is unprecedented. Let me break this down into the key points you need to understand about the property seizure threat and why it matters so much for Trump's financial and political situation. Point number one is that U.S. Marshals have not yet literally seized Trump's properties. That specific scenario has not happened, but the legal threat of seizure is completely real, and the groundwork for enforcement has already been laid. Videos dramatizing Marshals showing up at Trump Tower are imagining a scenario that could happen but hasn't happened yet. But the underlying reality, a massive judgment, explicit threats from the Attorney General to seize assets, and concrete legal steps to prepare for seizure is documented fact, not speculation. The seizure threat is real. It's just been temporarily paused by Trump posting a bond while his appeal proceeds. Point number two is that Judge Arthur Engoron found Trump committed persistent fraud by lying for years about asset values and ordered him to pay approximately $454 million, including interest. This is the largest civil penalty Trump has ever faced. The judgment was based on detailed findings that Trump systematically inflated property values to get better loan terms and insurance rates. The fraud wasn't one mistake or one exaggeration. It was a pattern of deliberate deception spanning many years and many financial statements. The massive penalty reflects the severity and persistence of the fraudulent conduct the court found. Point number three is that Attorney General Letitia James has explicitly and publicly said she will seek to seize Trump's properties if he can't pay the judgment, and she specifically identified 40 Wall Street as a building she's looking at. This isn't speculation about what might happen, and this is the Attorney General going on television and stating her enforcement intentions. She said she looks at 40 Wall Street each and every day. She said she would ask the judge to seize Trump's assets. These statements put Trump on notice that specific properties are being targeted and that seizure is the planned enforcement mechanism if he doesn't pay. Point number four is that James's office formally registered the civil fraud judgment in Westchester County, where Trump owns the Seven Springs estate and a golf club, as a concrete step toward potential seizure. Registering a judgment in a county creates liens against property in that county and positions the judgment creditor for enforcement actions. Reuters described this registration as a possible precursor to asset seizures. This wasn't just talk. This was the Attorney General taking procedural steps necessary to actually seize Trump's property if it comes to that. The groundwork has been laid. Point number five is that Trump temporarily saved off collection by posting a $175 million bond, which paused enforcement while his appeal proceeds. But the bond doesn't make the judgment go away. The appeals court agreed to pause collection if Trump posted the bond within 10 days. Trump did post the bond, using Knight Specialty Insurance as the backer. With the bond in place, James can't immediately levy on Trump's properties. But if Trump loses his appeal and can't pay the full judgment amount, the seizure threat returns. The bond is a pause, not a resolution. The underlying debt is still there. Point number six is that if Trump loses his appeal and can't pay, the actual enforcement mechanism involves sheriffs or marshals executing writs to levy on and sell his properties to satisfy the judgment. This is how civil judgments get collected when debtors don't pay. Courts issue writs of execution. Law enforcement officers show up to take possession of property. The property gets sold. The proceeds go to satisfy the debt. This mechanism is routine in civil cases. What's extraordinary here is the scale. Property is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and the identity of the debtor, a former president running for president again. But the legal mechanism is standard. Point number seven is that the property seizure threat has to be understood in context with Trump's other massive liabilities, including the Eugene Carroll verdict and ongoing legal fees from multiple cases. Trump doesn't just owe money from the civil fraud case, he owes money from other judgments. He's spending enormous sums on legal defense. His businesses face restrictions from the fraud ruling. When all these financial pressures are combined, serious questions arise about whether Trump can actually meet his obligations. The civil fraud judgment alone could threaten his empire. Combined with everything else, the financial pressure is unprecedented, and the possibility of forced asset sales or seizures becomes more real. Point number 8 is that the image of a sitting president fighting to keep state authorities from seizing his buildings contradicts Trump's projected image of unlimited wealth and invincible strength. Trump's brand is built on being fabulously wealthy, incredibly successful, and impossible to beat. But the reality behind the rallies and the strongman posturing is a man who had to scramble to post a $175 million bond to prevent his properties from being seized. That's not the image of a billionaire who can easily handle any financial challenge. That's the image of someone under serious financial pressure who's fighting to hold his empire together in the face of massive legal judgments. Point number 9 is that the property seizure threat creates ongoing vulnerability for Trump because the appeal could still fail and the bond doesn't guarantee he can actually pay the judgment if he loses. The appeal is not a sure thing. Courts do sometimes uphold fraud judgments on appeal, and even if Trump's lawyers find procedural or legal arguments to challenge the judgment, the underlying factual findings about fraud are well documented and hard to overturn. If the appeal fails and Trump has to pay the full judgment plus accumulated interest, we're back to the question of whether he actually has the money. And if he doesn't, we're back to James seeking to seize his properties. Point number 10 is that the timeline of the appeal and potential enforcement creates ongoing uncertainty that affects Trump's financial position and political standing. The appeal could take months or years to resolve. During that time, Trump has to maintain the bond. Interest continues to accrue on the judgment. The uncertainty affects Trump's ability to do business, get loans, and manage his financial affairs. Even if seizure never actually happens, the ongoing threat of seizure and the massive liability hanging over Trump affect his position in ways that compound over time. Point number 11 is that the property seizure story connects to all the other narratives about Trump's legal and financial pressures. The domino effect, the reckoning phase, the final balance shifting against him. Trump's financial problems from the civil fraud case interact with his legal problems from criminal cases. Money spent on bonds and legal fees is money unavailable for other purposes. Financial stress affects political operations. Legal defeats in one venue embolden opponents in other venues. The property seizure threat is one domino in a chain of dominoes that includes criminal cases, other civil judgments, congressional investigations, and political challenges. Everything connects everything. Point number 12 is that for content purposes, the property seizure story provides a powerful narrative about accountability and consequences. A president who committed fraud facing the real possibility of having his signature properties taken by law enforcement to pay the penalty. The dramatized videos imagining marshals at Trump Tower are imagining a specific scenario that hasn't happened yet, but they're imagining a scenario that's legally possible and that the Attorney General has explicitly said she's prepared to pursue. The real story, the judgment, the explicit seizure threats, the registered liens, the bond fight is dramatic enough without embellishment because it shows the legal system actually threatening to impose serious consequences on someone who committed serious fraud. Point number 13 is that Letitia James's statement that she looks at 40 Wall Street each and every day was a pointed message to Trump that she has specific targets in mind and is prepared to move on them. That wasn't a casual comment. That was the Attorney General identifying a specific Trump property, a 72-story Manhattan skyscraper, as a potential seizure target. She was telling Trump that she's already planning which buildings to take if enforcement becomes necessary. That kind of specific public identification of seizure targets makes the threat concrete and personal in a way that generic legal talk about enforcement mechanisms doesn't. Point number 14 is that understanding the difference between what's happened and what could happen helps you accurately assess Trump's situation. He's not currently losing buildings, but he's one lost appeal away from that being a real possibility. The bond has paused enforcement. The appeal is pending. Trump's buildings remain in his possession for now, but the judgment exists. The liability is real. The enforcement mechanisms have been prepared. If circumstances change, if the appeal fails, if the bond lapses, if Trump can't pay, the seizure machinery is ready to go. The Attorney General has said what she'll do. The question is whether circumstances ever require her to do it. Point number 15 is that the property seizure threat exemplifies the broader reckoning Trump faces, where years of conduct are finally producing consequences that threaten his wealth, his freedom, and his political future. Trump inflated his asset values for years and used those inflated values to get financial benefits he didn't deserve. Now a court has found he committed fraud and imposed a penalty designed to disgorge his allotted gains. The penalty is so large it could actually hurt him, could actually require selling properties or having them seized. That's accountability. That's consequences. That's the legal system saying that fraud has a price and that even a former president has to pay that price. The property seizure threat is what accountability looks like when the fraud is large enough and the penalty is severe enough to actually threaten someone's empire. The bottom line is this: U.S. Marshals have not yet shown up to padlock Trump Tower or seize Trump's properties. That specific scenario is dramatized in videos, but hasn't actually happened. But the threat of that happening is completely real. A court found Trump committed persistent fraud and ordered him to pay approximately $454 million. Attorney General Letitia James has explicitly said she will seek to seize Trump's properties if he can't pay, and she specifically identified 40 Wall Street as a target. Her office registered the judgment in Westchester County, where Trump owns the Seven Springs estate and a golf club, laying groundwork for potential seizure. Trump temporarily avoided collection by posting a $175 million bond, but that bond just pauses enforcement while his appeal proceeds. If Trump loses the appeal and can't pay the full judgment, the next steps really are liens, writs of execution, law enforcement officers taking possession of properties, and forced sales to satisfy the debt. The threat is real. The mechanisms are ready, and the only thing standing between Trump and having his signature properties seized are a bond and an appeal that could still fail. Behind the image of unlimited wealth and invincible strength is a man scrambling to prevent the legal system from dismantling his empire building by building. That's the real story. And it's dramatic enough without any fictional embellishment because it's actually happening to a sitting president of the United States.